the show. As you know, it's about inspirational people in the community, and today we are extremely lucky to have none other than the Right Honourable Lord Paul Boateng. Nice to meet you, sir.
Good to be with you.
And finally nail you down. You've got such a busy schedule. It's taken about 3 months or 4 months to get you.
I'm glad we're together now.
Yes, finally. So how have you been?
Good. Busy,
Yes,
as
you
always.
well.
But I think, in life, one's glad to have something to do. So
Yes.
I'm glad to be busy.
So tell us your story. Now, you grew up in London.
No,
you were born
I was
in
born
London?
in London,
Right.
in Hackney, and then I grew up in the Gold Coast and in Ghana,
Right.
as was, up until the age of 15. My mother and father met in London. She was training to be a teacher. He was training to be a lawyer. They got married, had me, and then went back to the Gold Coast because my father was by that time qualified as a barrister, wanted to practice law, to be part of the liberation movement at that time in the Gold Coast. My mother, too, was very strongly pro-liberation, a member of the movement for colonial freedom. So for them, it was a no-brainer, but to go back and to participate in the struggle.
In the fight.
And that's where I grew up.
All right. So how did his fight go with the party?
Well, he became a successful lawyer, a lawyer for the Convention People's Party, which was the main Independence Now party, and then in due course became a cabinet minister in the government of the late, great Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And my mother was a teacher and an educator of note in Ghana. Then there was a coup d'etat.
Right.
My dad was flung into prison without trial. We had to flee the country with 2 suitcases, my sister, myself, my mother, and we ended up on a council estate in West Hertfordshire in a place called Hemel Hempstead.
Right. So what years were there?
So this was 1966 when we returned to the UK.
London.
Yeah, the coup was in 66. The first republic was declared in 61. Ghana became independent in 1957. So I lived in West Africa throughout that exciting period. And it was a very exciting period when you got a sense that anything and everything was possible for Africa, for Ghana, and indeed for a vision which had Africa assuming its rightful place in the world. That struggle still continues. It's had its ups and downs, and there's no doubt that the coup d'etat, the CIA-inspired coup d'etat that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah was a major down, because his was a fine voice for Pan-Africanism and the role of Africa and Africans in the world.
Because there were those politicians out there that were on a higher level, just such a high level. When you heard the names, you stood to attention.
It was a very exciting time. I mean, I remember, growing up with the likes of George Padmore, the great West Indian intellectual and Pan-Africanist. He was part of my mother and father's friendship circle. W.E.B. Du Bois, who came to spend his last years in Ghana. And indeed, I sung at his funeral as a schoolboy.
So we can add singing to your attributes.
So it was a great time. It was a great time to be young and growing up in Africa.
But your name certainly was liberally peppered around the Thomas household, because my father was very political. So he was all into what was going on in Africa, and then to see somebody like yourself come through, it was almost putting you on the mantelpiece, Paul Boateng.
Well, I mean, but that too, of course, that was, as it were, the second phase of my life. But I owe that phase in which I became a lawyer and a member of parliament, a cabinet minister, a high commissioner in this country, I owe that second phase to the grounding I got in the first phase.
In the first 15 years.
In the first 15 years of my life, because my parents always brought me up to believe that we, all of us, had a responsibility to play an active part in civic life.
Right.
We had a responsibility to seek to leave the world a better place than the world which we found. But also, and importantly, I had a sense that there was nothing that, as a young African, I couldn't do. And that indeed is how I saw myself for many years. You didn't become aware of the issue of race as such, of the whole black-white divide. That was something that I discovered when I came as a virtual refugee to the UK, because the UK in the mid-60s was a very different place from now. You had Enoch Powell, who was fermenting a real sense of hatred and division in our society. I remember very well, actually, coming back from school, the local grammar school I went to on that council estate in Hertfordshire, one day, and it was the day after he had delivered an infamous speech called the Rivers of Blood speech. And someone shouted to me from a passing van, "Go back home, nigger," or words to that effect. And that really was the first time I had come across in-your-face racism. In the UK. And one had to have a response to that.
Absolutely.
And the response was one of resistance. The response was one of making sure that we equipped ourselves for a life of struggle against racism in this country as part of the wider struggle. Because don't forget, the 60s too were also the time of the great struggle for liberation in the United States, the struggle for liberation in southern Africa, the Vietnam War. So the anti-apartheid struggle, the Vietnam War, the civil rights struggle were all part of our struggle.
Almost
here in the UK.
That struggle for freedom and equality was global. It was global.
It was, and indeed, in my view, is.
Yeah.
I think we've made real gains. But I think one of the things we learn from Trump's America, one of the things we learn from the rise of the far right in Europe, is that we can never afford, as black people, as people of colour, to be complacent. We have constantly to be vigilant against.
Yes, because I think it's always nipping at your heels. It's always nipping at your heels. But you, obviously, being in Ghana for the first 15 years, you had a very different life from when you had to come as a refugee in 1966. How was that for you, that transition? Well,
the transition was stark, but I was very fortunate. I had a very loving mother.
Which is everything,
is everything, actually. I had the fortune of finding myself in a very good state grammar school, with an excellent headmaster and teachers. I never forget my debt of gratitude to them, and I made a strong body of friends in that school, which have stayed with me to this day. I was the only black boy in the school. In fact, I think at that time I was probably the only black boy in Hemel Hempstead. I mean, yeah, that's how I was in those days.
Yeah.
I remember, and that had real consequences for oneself as a teenager because nobody knew how to cut black hair.
Oops.
And at that time, I had a lot of hair, and they used to approach it like they were cutting a sheep. I mean, it was horrendous. But life, you adapt, and I had a strong Christian faith, and that I think also, that I know, also helped enormously.
Yeah, but you must have had a great resolve to claw your way back from the coming here as a refugee to where you are now.
Well, I never really saw it in that way. I was brought up to believe in hard work,
Yes.
to believe in excellence,
Good qualities,
and to believe that you had to apply yourself to make the very most of your life, and that obstacles, the stuff that life throws up, were there to be overcome, and that was the way that I had been brought up, and that indeed is how subsequently I came to live my life.
Yes.
So I was very fortunate to have that upbringing and a very strong sense that I wanted to make a contribution and that I wasn't going to allow anything to get in the way of that. And the law, which was the profession I chose, I always saw as an instrument of social change. So it wasn't simply a question of doing and obtaining a qualification that would give you a sort of high status occupation in which you could earn money. You obviously wanted to work. You wanted to have employment. You wanted to be able to pay the rent, to buy a house, and all those things. But primarily, you were there in order to be useful and to make an impact and to make a difference and to make a change. And the law was the best way of doing that.
And you see, that's the basic principle of what we are all about. It's about, if I am making something, it's sharing it with you to bring you up as well. And that's where the change comes. It's not all just about what I can make for myself.
Yes. And there's a wonderful saying by a teacher, a rabbi who lived at the same time as our Lord, and his name was Hillel, Rabbi Hillel. And what he used to say was this, and it's all about self-reliance, interdependence, and action. And what he used to say was this: if I am not for me, who will be for me? Right. The importance of self-reliance. But if I am only for me, what am I? If I'm only for me, what am I? The importance of recognizing that the human condition is one that, if we are to fulfill our mission as humans, requires that we be interdependent, that we rely on one another. But if I am only for me, what am I? And then he went on to say, if not now, when? The importance of action, of getting on with it, a practical delivery, and to which I always add when talking to any group of people, if not you, who?
Yeah.
It's something that all of us have got a responsibility to live out that particular saying, it seems to me.
Yes. So when was the first inkling that law was your thing?
I'm the son of a lawyer. Right. I grew up surrounded by what all the law entails. Right. So my father would go off to court in the morning with his wig, his gown, with his briefs, which is how we bundle together our legal papers.
Yeah.
We tie them with red string and we call them briefs. So he would go off in the morning with his briefs, and that's what I was used to. That's how my dad was. And also, and importantly at that time, because don't forget we're talking about the 1950s in the Gold Coast, my father was fighting cases for the Liberation Party.
Oh, okay.
And there was opposition very often to what he was doing. And he would return sometimes from the assizes, from going on trek out into the northern part of the country and into Ashanti. He would return with bullet holes in the car. And of course, and they were just there, and for me, growing up, I'd say, well, that was just part of life.
But I mean, a pretty fine role model to be looking at.
But what it meant was that I knew always that the law was a means of not just giving the dispossessed a voice. That was very important, and my father always did that in his practice. It was also a means of making a difference. So when I found myself looking around for choices to make in terms of university, much as I would very much like to have read, for instance, history of art, much as I would very much have liked to have become an opera singer or an actor, and I would have liked to have been all those things, been and done all those things. For me, in 1968, which is when I had to make my decision about what I was going to study, there was only one possible option: law, of course, because I wanted to make a difference, because the streets of Paris were the scene of great events. There was massive demonstrations against the Vietnam War in Grosvenor Square. The civil rights movement was at its height in the United States. The struggle against apartheid and racism was at its height in relation to Rhodesia, in relation to South Africa. So there was no question other than I was going to be a lawyer. And I saw a wonderful program on television. It just shows you how different television was in those days. Over, I think it was 2 weeks, a 2-week-long documentary about an incredible lawyer called Benedict Bernberg. He's still alive, older now, of course, retired. But he was a civil rights lawyer, solicitor in this country. And I thought, well, I want to be like him. I want to work for him. I want to work and qualify as a lawyer, and I want to work in a law center and be part of the struggle for better housing conditions, against police oppression, and all those things that were going on at that time.
And where did you start that? Where were you?
I started with Benedict Bernberg. Right. Straight after university, I did my professional exams and joined him as an article clerk with Benedict Bernberg, and he was a great teacher. He, Tess Gill, Judith Walker, these were my principals at that time, and I couldn't have had a better grounding.
Yeah, definitely. So you then retrained as a barrister?
Many years later. Right. I made my reputation as a lawyer, first of all as a solicitor, on the ground, working at a grassroots level, because barristers at that time were not allowed to work in law centres.
Oh, okay.
So I always did advocacy. I always was an advocate, because I had won various debating competitions and so on growing up in the UK and at university. I was president of my debating union on the student council and so on. So I was always an advocate, but I was a solicitor, and that's how I made my reputation. As a result of struggles, first of all, against the SUS laws, the Vagrancy Acts, as they were called.
1970s.
SUS, this was an offence of being a person suspected of being likely to commit an arrestable offence. Essentially, it was used as a means of social control against young black people.
Exactly, yeah.
And large numbers were picked up, criminalised, whenever they went to the West End or in any way the target of police actions. They were arrested for the sus on a very, very low evidential threshold. It was a very insidious law. And as a result of a group of black women in Lewisham, they're coming together and saying, enough is enough. We're not going to allow this to happen to our children anymore. And they invited me to come to their meeting and to be their legal advisor. And I became their legal advisor, worked with them on the campaign, and eventually the law was repealed. But it was a struggle.
A big fight.
It was a big fight.
Well.
And the lesson I learned from that fight was that to bring about change, you have to build alliances. Alliances between people of different races, alliances between people of different parties. Very interestingly, the struggle against SUS, initially, the Labour Party was totally opposed to repealing the law.
Really?
Oh yes, they upheld. I never forget. There was a great man called Lord Pitt and another great man called Rt.Hon. And these two men held a debate in the House of Lords at a time when Labour was in office. And you had this Liberal Democrat and this Labour peer, Lord Pitt, great man, a doctor, first black president of one of the great royal societies, the BMA, and the minister who spoke against the repeal of the law was a Labour minister. And ultimately, we gave evidence the campaign gave evidence to a select committee which was chaired by a man called Sir John Wheeler, who was a Conservative. He accepted our arguments, and indeed it was a subsequent Conservative government that repealed it. Yeah. So the thing about race is that at the end of the day, to bring about change, you have to organize, you have to strategize, and you cannot put people in little boxes labeled black, white, Asian, Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem. Race and the struggle against racism involves us all. And racism is to be found everywhere, on the left, right, and centre of the political
And the key, I think, is in you saying you have to organise and strategize, because a lot of times people are having a fight, but they've got no strategy. They actually don't really know what the end result is that they want or what they're looking for. They're just against whatever it is, but with no strategy and no organisation.
You're absolutely right. Grassroots mobilisation. And building consciousness and awareness is the key. And recognizing, too, that everybody ought to have a voice. I mean, and I will never, ever cease in my admiration for this group of ordinary black women who came together and said, enough is enough.
Start of it all.
No more. And as a result, they brought about a fundamental change in the law, and the beginning of a process that led ultimately to the election of black and minority ethnic members of parliament.
Yes. So when did politics come into your mind as a direction?
Politics has always been part of my life, in the sense that I grew up in a political family. Was very conscious growing up in Ghana of political struggles. I mean, we were engaged in a struggle for liberation. And so I was always interested in politics. But I joined the Labour Party when I was 15. So that's a very very long time ago. And I was a young member of the Labour Party, young
Labour Party,
young socialist. And that was a time in which, frankly, in the 1960s, in 1966, when most thinking young people were political. And we had debates and we had discussions. And I never forget, we had a school debating society, obviously, and I was active in that, the captain of the debating society. I won a competition in my first year back in the UK, a debating competition. Because, when you are a refugee and you are new and you don't know anyone, you don't know, you have to find a role for yourself in your school. I didn't know anyone in that school. I wasn't good at sports. I never forget, I was keen on sports. I'm an Arsenal supporter, but as I was keen on football, I was never any good at sports involving balls and bats and kicking. So I never forget, on my first day at this school, Apsley Grammar School, my headmaster took me out onto the sports field where all these boys my age were, and he said to these boys, by way of introducing me, "This is Boateng, and he's going to take us into the county cricket finals next year." So I said, hold on a moment. What the hell is he talking about? I don't even play cricket. But of course, what he had done, dear kind man that he was, he had confused Ghana with Guyana. In Guyana, they play
completely different continents behind you.
In Guyana, they play cricket. Yeah. In Ghana, we don't play cricket. We play football. We don't play cricket. We never have.
But it begins with a G.
Exactly, and it's black. So anyway, be that as it may, I had then rapidly to find my feet and find something I could do, and I knew I could speak. Right. And so I became captain of the debating society, and we won in that first year the English-speaking union's county prize. Right. And the English-speaking union is where we are now.
All right.
This organization in my first year, which is an organization that promotes public speaking and self-expression amongst young people, this is its global headquarters. In my first year, they gave me, this young refugee child, in the council estate in Hertfordshire, they gave me a sense of my own worth and potential.
Oh,
and I never
looked back today.
And here I am as chairman. But because again, I owe them, and this is my opportunity to give back. But to go back to your question, because we were all debating and discussing as young people, we had different views. And the chairman of the governing body of this school, who was a publican, he owned a pub. I'll never forget his name. His name was John Butex. And he owned the Bell Public House in Hemel Hempstead, in the old High Street. And once a month, he would make available the upstairs room in his pub for debate between young conservatives and young socialists. So we all cut up, and people came along. Some of the people were young conservatives, some were young socialists. We debated. But
you cut your teeth talking.
Exactly. And everybody, and every young person at that time, every thinking young person at that time was involved in politics. So politics had always been part of my life. But I never considered running for elected office, not until the early 1980-81. And the reason for that simply was, again, because of what I learned as I was representing this group of black mothers. I had to go and make representations to local authorities, to Parliament. And the more I met these councillors and parliamentarians...
I can do that.
Exactly. That's exactly what I thought. I thought, I can do that. And by the way, where are the black people? Where are we? We weren't there. There were no blacks.
That's what we're talking about, making a change.
There were no black people on local authorities. There were no black people in Parliament. And so I said, well, this isn't on. I've got to be. And I got sick and tired of seeing my clients and my community patronized and dumped on, frankly.
Yeah.
And my girlfriend, my now wife, Janet, and I both determined that we were going to get involved in elected politics. and I became a citywide councillor. She became a local councillor, the first black chair of social services anywhere in the UK. And
and what area did she come?
Lambeth.
Lambeth.
So
and you were?
I represented Walthamstow.
Walthamstow. That's right.
So we both felt that we wanted to make a difference politically, and that was a time too when we began to work with others to form the Black Sections movement, to demand the right of autonomy and self-expression within the Labour Party, and to campaign for black representation at a parliamentary level. And I was approached in '83 to run for Parliament. I did, unsuccessfully, and I never forget what was one awful day campaigning in the 1983 general election. It was a very bad time for the Labour Party, but we were campaigning in a place called Tring, and to be frank with you, it was a wet, rainy day, and we'd met some real racism at the doors, which we were knocking on, and 4 or 5 people had come up from Brent to help me in this campaign. They didn't know me, they knew of me, and they wanted to be part of this process of getting a black person elected. So after we'd been through this day, they knew we were going to lose, actually. And they said, "Paul, we promise you, this is never going to happen to you again. We are going to be looking for a black candidate at the next general election, and we want it to be you." And that group of people, led by Cedric Best and Mike Maguire, I'll never forget their names, those 2 Caribbean Labour Party activists were as good as their word. And they led my campaign in Brent South, first of all for the selection and then the election. And in 1987, I was elected as one of the first black.
Well, there's a classic example of what you mentioned about the rabbi working together and having a team. Can't do it on your own. No, you need people to build a house. You need more than one brick that works together.
There were black people, white people, Asian people in Brent South who were absolutely determined that they were going to get me as a black person elected as their member of Parliament. And Arjen Sharma, Len Snow, Peggy Quirk, these Cedric Best, Mike Maguire, black, white, Asian men, women coming together to say, yes, we're going to make a change, we're going to make a difference here in Brent South, and they did, and I'm eternally grateful to them.
And you were first elected when?
In 1987.
And you've had many roles in different positions, haven't you?
Yes.
Starting in...
Well, I began my ministry. Of course, first of all, we had to win an election.
Right.
And it was a tough time for the Labour Party.
Yes, it was.
We weren't winning elections in the 1980s and in the early 1990s. This was a terrible time for the Labour Party. But I was appointed to the front bench, first of all, in a Treasury role. Then I became legal affairs spokesperson. And then in 1997, Labour formed a government. I became a junior minister for health. And then I rose up the ranks as police minister, as prisons minister, as financial secretary to the Treasury, then as chief secretary to the Treasury in the cabinet. But it was a struggle. And it didn't just happen. And, let's be very clear. We are black people. And as black people, we have to work twice as hard as
I love that you're putting it out there. I love that you're putting it out there. Because it's the truth.
That's the reality.
It is the truth.
And that's what one had to do. And that's the experience of black people down the ages. And it is true. It is as true today as it is at any other time. But you persist, and you form relationships, you form friendships, you form alliances, you strategize.
Yeah.
And you try and make a difference in all the jobs that you are in and that you are called to.
Now, what are your present projects? Because, I mean, you are so vast all over the world, as you told me earlier. You live globally, literally. So what are your projects at the moment?
Well, you know, I was hugely privileged to serve and to represent Brent South for 18 years as their member of Parliament, and to do various ministerial roles, ending up in the cabinet during that time. But you know, I was brought up an African. I'm British and I'm an African.
Yeah.
And I'd got to the stage, frankly, in 2005 when I'd had enough. I really had enough of domestic politics, and I wanted to work in Africa. And Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, for all their issues, and yes, we know that there were issues. We know,
as there are anywhere.
As they are anywhere. We know of the tensions in their relationship. We know of where we all could have done better. But one thing one should never ever forget, that both those men, and they were different men, in their different ways, but both of them had a heart for Africa. And it's to their great credit that under their prime ministership and chancellorship, Britain committed to 0.7% of its GDP to go on overseas development assistance, a commitment that no successive coalition or Conservative government has ever felt able to renege on. And Tony Blair started and created the Africa Commission, the majority of whose members were African leaders from politics, from the private sector, from civil society. And I was an alternate member of that commission, the Prime Minister's special envoy. Brown and Blair worked very strongly on Africa. And I came to the view in 2005 that I wanted to work in Africa. And so I asked them and told them I wanted to step down, and asked them for an opportunity to work in Africa, and the opportunity arose to become High Commissioner to South Africa.
Okay.
And that was something which I, of course, jumped at with enthusiasm, because my family had been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle from the very outset. My mother and father were friends of Oliver and Adelaide Tambo. Oliver and Adelaide Tambo, when they were first deployed outside South Africa by Nelson Mandela to set up the overseas wing of the African National Congress, came to Ghana. After Tanzania, they came to Ghana. Before they came to the UK, became friends of my parents. So we'd had a family link with the Tambos.
Right.
Going back all those decades. Yeah. My wife was active in the anti-apartheid movement. Janet was active in the anti-apartheid movement. I was active in the anti-apartheid movement in this country. So the chance to go and represent the people of the United Kingdom in South Africa was something that I seized with great enthusiasm, and was fortunate in serving there for 4.5 years. And now a large part of my life is devoted to work on development in Africa. So
any particular place in Africa?
Yeah, I chair something called the African Enterprise Challenge Fund, right, which is a multi-donor fund to benefit small farmers and rural Africa through agribusiness and through renewable energy. And we make soft loans and grants to companies in now 25 African countries where they can demonstrate an impact on the rural poor. Right. So they've got to show how they're connecting small farmers to regional and global markets, right, moving them from subsistence farming to farming which really gives them a real living. Yeah. And that's a fund run out of Nairobi, I was appointed 18 months ago, and I've grown it now, restructured it and grown it. So now we have over $310 million under management for small farmers in Africa. I'm also on various advisory boards with a strong developmental focus in the private sector. But in addition to that, I chair a number of charities which work in Africa.
Right.
Bouquet International.
Right.
Our headquarters is in Camberwell Green, and we rely entirely on voluntary money and effort.
Right.
And on the British and global publishing industry. Last year, we sent more than 1 million brand new books to sub-Saharan Africa. We trained scores of librarians in sub-Saharan Africa. And now the charity's been going for over 60 years. Prince Philip is our patron. It helped me as a little boy growing up in the Gold Coast with library books. And now we have expanded our activities to include the Caribbean, and we're providing emergency disaster relief to Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica, following on from the recent hurricane. So that's a great charity. Look it up, Bouquet International, and we don't get a penny piece. Right. From government. We don't want money from governments. Individuals and companies help us. And volunteers. They pack books in Camberwell Green. So if anyone's got any time for volunteering,
can you hear that? Camberwell Green Book Aid.
Check out Book Aid. So I do that. I chair the International Council of the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which is a strong youth development charity.
Yes, I did that at school.
Did you?
Yes, I did.
Well, we work in the Caribbean, we work in Africa, and so I chair that International Council, and I chair a charity concerned with promoting science in Africa, the Planet Earth Institute, and this charity, the English-Speaking Union, which works not just in Africa. We work in the UK, in Europe, in the United States, and in the UK, we are about promoting public speaking, oracy, the development of communication skills in schools in Britain. And we work in some of the most deprived schools in Britain. Again, it's all voluntary. You can
see why it is near on impossible to get this guy. Because
it's all about volunteering. Yeah. It's about engaging with the local community. Things that I'm very passionate about.
And this entails a lot of traveling, global travel.
Yeah.
So it must be exhausting, crossing time zones endlessly, or are you just used to it now?
I never complain about the opportunity to engage with other people and to make a difference. I've had a blessed life, and I owe a very great deal in that respect to my wife, obviously, who has been my partner these many years. Janet, she's a Barbadian like you, British like you, and a strong black woman. And she and I have been blessed in each other, in our 5 children, in our seven grandchildren, and in our shared faith. I think life, all sorts of things happen in life.
Indeed.
Some of them not so good, and they can happen to anyone at any time. And a faith and loving relationships get you.
As you said earlier, you had a loving mother, which is everything. And as you say, you bring it back now. Yes. The loving relationship, it nurtures everything.
It's very important.
It's very important. So with this hugely busy schedule, what does Paul Boateng do to look after himself, to get his equilibrium and not become overwhelmed by all of this?
I think really it's down to family, isn't it?
Right. They keep you grounded.
Family keep you grounded. You do things together as a family. It's half term. So when I've finished my meetings today, I'm off to see my grandchildren, one of my grandchildren, and then we're going to spend time together
family time
over half term.
Nice.
I'm looking forward to that. And as I say, I'm an Arsenal supporter. These are difficult times for the club.
Yes,
don't ask me about the manager. Don't ask me about whether we're going to end up in the top 4. I'll answer any question about anything political, but don't ask me about
us. I won't put you on this spot. It's okay.
But it's a great team, and we've had great days, and we will have great days again.
Well, what goes around comes around, isn't it? Everything comes in a cycle. You're at the top 1 minute. I mean, look at Liverpool. They used to be at the top all the time. Now you can't even see them. They're so far down.
Oh, well,
so, Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Absolute pleasure and honour.
Thank you.
Sir, Right Honourable Lord Paul Boateng. See you next time. Yes.
Well, I enjoyed it.